I'm going to show you the World Champions last round game from the Shamkir Super Tournament. Remember, if you want to subscribe to the channel, then do click on the button down there. And if you want to support the channel, then do check out the links in the video description for PayPal. And also patreon.com. Check out the rewards there, extra videos and all kinds of other stuff. Okay, here we go, on with the game. So Carlsen in the last round playing against Alexander Grischuk, who's having quite a decent tournament, and well, we know what a strong player he is. These last rounds often can be a bit of an anticlimax because, well, we know that Magnus is the winner of the tournament already, so you know he could just play very solidly and drift in with a draw. And the same goes for the other players in the tournament. You know, can be an anticlimax. So let's see what happened in this game. Berlin from Grischuk, super solid. Endgame, no. The current fashion among the big guys is to keep more tension in the position. With if they're playing for a win, then to play d3. Bishop c5, the most adventurous move, and c3. So we get these very typical positions where it's really subtle. It's about ideas, and you know, every pawn move often can make a big difference to the position. But you know, there are no forcing variations here, or very few anyway. Bishop a4 from Magnus. So he's, you know, looking to preserve that bishop instead of exchange, you know, one of these variations where you exchange on c6. Knight e7, typical maneuver from Grischuk to spin the knight round to g6, where it can, well, it's obviously supporting e5 still, but on a safer square than c6. And bishop c2 all the way back from Magnus. So it's well, we just get these typical positions basically that look like they could come from many other variations of the Spanish. And d4. The bishop goes back, so you can see that the e5 pawn is solidly protected. And now a4. So as ever, when the rook's pawn advances, then black has a bit of a dilemma. Do you put the pawn on a5? But then that can, you know, give away these squares and you know, make it interesting if a knight comes to c4. Or do you play a6, but then white can, you know, gain a little bit more ground? Or do you simply leave that pawn there and play c6? So preventing a5 and also allowing the bishop to drop here. Well, that's what Grischuk did. But always a bit of a dilemma. You never know how far to let that pawn advance. Here it's quite possible just to develop the knight to d2, but Carlsen had an interesting little idea in mind. He took on e5, which looks very tame. But there is a point to this. So Grischuk exchanged knights, that's reasonable. Looks very dry with this near symmetrical pawn structure and the queens coming off the board. But here is Carlsen's idea. After that exchange, he can now push on with the a pawn. So he's gained territory on the queen side. Now, at the moment, that's not significant, but it could be later on. Originally, Carlsen had intended b4 here to gain even more space. But when he reached this position, he wasn't so sure. It'd be nice if white had a few moves here, you know, bishop e3, f3 to stop knight g4, bring the knight to maybe d2 and to c4 or b3, then that looks pretty nice. But well, before we can play bishop e3, you've got to play f3. Bishop e6, and you know, this bishop could come in here, and if knight a3, then b5 is a nice move, because this gets nowhere because of this pin. So after b5, black is absolutely fine there. So in this position, Carlsen decides just to play knight d2. Bishop e6 looks like a good move, controlling these squares, putting the bishop on a nice solid square. And rook e1. Now, even though white has this pawn on a5, somehow black's position can't be that bad. His pieces are very well positioned here. The rook is on the open file. Of course, the rook can't enter on that d file, but still, black has control of the d file, so it should be fine for black. But here, I think Grischuk overreacted. He played the pawn to b5. Maybe just a6 here. And bringing the knight round to e8 and possibly to c7, possibly to d6, looking at these squares. It should be about equal. But Grischuk played b5, and that creates some weaknesses. Although I understand why he wanted to sort of fight back on the queen side. Knight b3, attacking the bishop. And if the bishop were to retreat, let's say to f8, then a6 is a bit annoying with the idea of knight e5 and possibly, obviously attacking the pawn, but possibly knight b7. And that knight controls some very important squares in black's position. So here, after knight b3, Grischuk took the step of giving up the two bishops. Now, he thought for 27 minutes over this decision. Clearly not something he was desperate to do, but felt, he was already perhaps in danger of being worse if he didn't take. So that gives Carlsen something really tangible in the position, the bishop pair. Nevertheless, black's bishop and knight certainly aren't badly placed here. Knight g4, attacking the pawn, and that's simply defended. Rook d6. Yeah, I'm not sure how accurate that move is, but perhaps by this stage it doesn't matter that much. In a sense, white has this permanence advantage. The point is this: Carlsen now played bishop g5. It's an excellent move. It basically just gains a tempo. Threat is to put the bishop on e7 with a skewer, winning material. It also stops rook f6 actually as well. So black has to waste a move. So king f8. And now rook f1. Now that's an important move. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but in fact what's happening is that this bishop can now retreat back along this diagonal. So it sits on c1 and controls the d2 square. And basically, c1 is a good square for the bishop. It's just in this position, white has got his rook out the other side of that bishop. The bishop doesn't want to come back this way because then the d2 square will sometimes be available for a rook. So that move, bishop g5, was important to gain a tempo. And the rook on f1 is very well placed because it's going to support the advance of the f pawn. So nice little shuffle, putting the king on a light square, so away from that bishop. And the bishop drops back. So important. These squares are covered. So black's control of the d file actually really doesn't mean much in this position. So Grischuk is looking perhaps to bring the knights around here. f4. So the threat is to take on e5 and to play bishop f4. And if pawn takes pawn, then bishop takes is already pretty nasty for black, considering that the bishop and rook are lined up against f7. So f6. Now that bishop looks pretty good on that diagonal. And Carlsen starts the press on the king side. And again, it's one of these situations where the rook's pawn advances and black isn't quite sure whether to ignore it, whether to let that pawn run the whole way, or to block it with h5 or h6. Which square do you block it on? Carlsen thought that h5 was perhaps a way for black to defend, but that pawn can be vulnerable. If we just drop the rook back, then sometimes, well, we might sometimes play rook d1, but sometimes the bishop will come to d1 to attack that pawn, which could be rather irritating. So it certainly doesn't solve black's problems. Rook e8 played and h5, and now if the pawn comes to h6, that certainly looks more serious for black, starting to undermine the f6 square. So Grischuk blocked, and bishop a2, perhaps preempting knight c5, maybe looking to advance the b pawn. And here Grischuk, I think, made quite a big strategic mistake. He was starting to get short of time here. Still actually a pretty unclear position. If Grischuk were to exchange on f4 and play knight c5, and yes, strategically it feels like white is doing very well here. I like this h-pawn controlling these pawns, and I like this central pawn majority with the rooks here, and obviously the two bishops. However, this knight offers black some counterplay, and this is still a very tricky position. Okay, let's go back to this position. So here, Carlsen has just dropped back with bishop a2. c5 played by Grischuk. Now, if that pawn advances to c4, locking out the bishop, and then the knight will come into c5, then black has obviously achieved a great deal. And clearly that's what Grischuk was going for. But Carlsen plays a very clever move now to stop that idea. Bishop e3. Well, this looks in a sense pretty obvious because the bishop pins the pawn. Obviously the c pawn can't advance now. But actually it gives up a pawn, and this is what Grischuk had simply underestimated. So he took, and rook takes e4. So pawn sack from Carlsen, but for a strategic aim, which is to keep that pawn here. Bishop b1 played, attacking the rook, which retreated, and rook fe1. So what's Carlsen got for the pawn? This bishop on a7 is still out of the game. This bishop finds a beautiful diagonal. So this light square bishop is kind of ruling the roost at the moment, looking really good on that diagonal. This knight also is really limited in its activities, considering that this pawn can't move, and the e5 square is obviously taken. So this is tough. So excellent positional compensation. And here, short of time, Grischuk makes a further error. He could still hope to hang on with knight b8, actually, improving the position of that knight. And after this, knight c6, bishop comes in here. It's still very tricky for black. Mating ideas now. But the knight will come to e7 to cover those light squares. And the bishop could drop back here. That's one possibility, just with good compensation for the pawn. You could also play king f3 and even allow this to be exchanged, because it's still rather difficult for black to free himself in this position. So still black has chances to hold after knight b8. But Grischuk played f5, sacking the pawn back, and you know, this is pretty well motivated because it does give that knight a nice square on f6, and the knight looks at some good squares here. But in fact, it's simply good for white in this position. Knight came to d5, and Grischuk here was expecting the bishop just to retreat to d2, but he had overlooked rook d2. It's a good move. Another pin. It's very nasty. Rooks and bishops work extremely well together. And if knight takes... Now, you might think that white has blundered material, but actually here, this is completely crushing. The bishop has to retreat, for example, and that pawn is going to cost black a piece at least. It might not even be possible for black to stop that pawn advancing the whole way. There you go. It just shows that this pawn, when is really proving its worth. When you gain space, then in the end game this can be really significant. You know, if that one goes, then the pawn on a5 is almost home. Grischuk played rook d8, bishop e4. Still pinned here. Rook d1. So another pin, so black has to play this. And now it's pretty simple. Grischuk already captured with the knight. If rook takes, then this endgame is absolutely miserable. Bishop b7. If white takes here, that's just winning. So the knight defends, and now king e4. Well, the knight can't move, the bishop can't move. The king is about to waltz in here or here. There is really... Oh, I'm not surprised Grischuk declined to enter into this endgame. It's just horrible, absolutely horrible. That's the two bishops for you. Okay, so in this position, knight takes played, and rook d6, and that was the last move of the game. Grischuk resigned. So black is just getting pinned to pieces here. And rook takes pawn about to happen. Well, we might see something like this. And once again, that a pawn really can't be stopped. So we've seen everything from Magnus in this tournament. We've seen beautiful endgame performances like today and against David Navarra. We've seen lightning attacks against Anish Giri and also against Sergei Karyakin. Beautiful positional chess. And it has been just a supreme performance from him. So he won the tournament with 7 out of 9. All the other games were drawn yesterday in Shamkir. It was a bit of an anticlimax, as often last rounds are in these big tournaments. But for Carlsen, no, he kept going the whole way. 7 out of 9, 2 points clear of the players in second place. That was Karyakin and Ding, who had 5. So Carlsen this year going from strength to strength, and it's going to be very interesting to see how he plays in the Grenka tournament starting in about, let me see, 10 days time, something like that. He'll be facing Fabiano Caruana among others, so watch out for that. Thanks for watching.